Yeah, I'm gonna spoil this photograph. I don't know how to pose.
Eh? You're wrong of one day. One, two. Good evening, colleagues. If we may settle down so that we can begin the program. My name is Pedro. My surname is Mzileni. I am the research assistant in the chair for critical studies in higher education transformation called CRISHET, and I have the privilege of being your program director this evening. Tonight, as you might be aware, is the 24th of July, which is almost the end of what we call in the university the centenary celebrations of our namesake, Nelson Mandela, where a variety of activities have been taking place in the university over the past 12 months, reflecting on the legacy of this particular figure. And the contribution that is going to be made today is on one of his areas of life that I could say are under-researched. And Professor Xolela Mangcu is our guest tonight, who's going to table that specific discussion. Firstly, let me acknowledge the guests that are with us in the room, the chairperson of council, Ambassador Nozipho January Badil, the Vice Chancellor, Professor Xolela Mangcu. I also see the Deputy Vice Chancellor. It's now called Peoples and Operations. Mr. Lebohang Ashatse, the Dean of Students, Lutando Jack, and the entire senior management and the academics, staff, and students of the university, the media, everyone, colleagues, Molweni, good evening. I want to begin with a disclaimer, is that I'm not wearing a cap because I am disrespecting the gathering. There was an accident with the barber this morning. And the barber is in the venue. So Pardon me, colleagues. That's what honestly happened this morning. So let's proceed. Without wasting time, colleagues, I am going to invite the Vice-Chancellor of the university, who does not need any introduction, Professor Xolela Mangcu, to give the opening remarks. Over to you, Prof.
Thanks, Program Director. Who is the Papa? I would like to avoid. Perhaps you should go under Lebohang's entrepreneurship development to hone their skills. Thanks, Program Director Pedro. It gives me great pleasure to welcome an eminent scholar this evening, Professor Xolela Mangcu, to Nelson Mandela University, and to welcome everyone that is here to the first of the two Mandela lecture series that signal the close of our celebrations of the Mandela centenary. And I do also again want to, as Pedro has done, to recognize our chairperson of council, who is here with us this evening. Thanks, ma'am. And the DVCs and the academics and the students and the activists, scholars, everyone that is here this evening, you are most welcome. The centenary celebrations have been rooted in the intellectual mandate and the purpose of our university. Inherent to that purpose is our understanding and our preferred formulation of Mandela as a social figure of justice. As the only university to be named after him, these celebrations have been particularly important to us as the university. I saw also Professor Van Harris from the Nelson Mandela Foundation, who is also our visiting scholar here. Welcome, Professor, this evening. As the only university to be named after Mandela, these celebrations have been particularly important to us, not only to celebrate the man, but also to inquire into what his legacy means for us as we strive to be a university that has publicly placed its work in service to society. This has included a critical exploration of Mandela, how he has been framed, and how he calls us to a future of generative possibilities. The celebrations at our university started of the centenary of the birth of Madiba. They started in July last year. And we kicked that off with the Faculty of Education colloquium, which explored what the meaning of the weapon in Mandela's much celebrated saying that education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change the world. And then after that, we had a series of lectures and colloquia and other events headlined by the faculties of law, of science, and of education, and many others. Another notable initiative was the launch of the annual Nelson Mandela Convention for Youth Development, the first iteration of which was titled Living in the Age of and Hope of Madiba, and it focused on issues relating to education, leadership, employability, entrepreneurship, health, and wellness. In September 2018, we held the iBhunga, this time that Mandela Film, Book, and Documentary Festival, where we explored the multiplicity of the figure of Mandela through the myriad books, films, and documentaries about him. This was a precursor to the iBhunga, this time that Mandela colloquium, which many of you were at in March this year. This colloquium explored the figure of Mandela in relation to a number of key issues facing the academy and potential avenues for a critical Mandela studies program, which we hope to advance with the establishment of our entity called the Transdisciplinary Institute for Mandela Studies, called TIMS. Professor Mangcu was one of the key contributors who was invited to the colloquium, where he shared his work relating to two of the significant themes arising out of the colloquium: Mandela, context, critique, contestations, and the archive. And perhaps most pertinently to tonight, Mandela, modernity, autobiography, and history. At the colloquium and in these lectures, Professor Mangcu draws on his expertise in writing a biography. You will recall that Professor Mangcu has also earlier authored a bigger biography, which is actually an award-winning biography, Xolela, and I would like to recognize that. He is at present working on Nelson Mandela biography. Considering Nelson Mandela's status as a global icon, it seems surprising that there is anything new to learn about him still. And yet, as it was revealed at the Mandela Colloquium, the plethora of biographies and biopics of Mandela tend to be dominated by certain narratives of romanticization of him. Prof. Mangcu's work, as he discussed at the colloquium in March, and as he will unpack for us in detail in these two lectures, is to unearth a far more nuanced and critical biography of Mandela that pays close attention to the details as well as contradictions of his life and its archive. It is vital that we, as a university that bears his name, celebrate his legacy. However, as a scholarly institution, as a university, it is imperative that we temper our celebration with a scholarly critique. We cannot uncritically accept ready-made narratives of Madiba, especially when properly historicized understandings of Mandela provide, as the colloquium revealed to us in March, a far more useful tool for thinking through our responsibilities as a university striving for social justice within a system that has embedded within it a series of restrictions that we cannot completely escape at this stage. Tonight's lecture, as Pedro has told us, that is titled The Untold Heritage, will explore, as you have seen from the advert also, a facet of Mandela's heritage that has been obscured in the biographies of Mandela that already do exist. It challenges the tribalization of Mandela's history by bringing to our attention Mandela's experience with political modernity and thus adding a new layer of understanding of his political pragmatism. Next week, on the 31st of July, Professor Mangcu will give a lecture entitled Mandela's Tragic Pragmatism, Leadership as Radical Sacrifice. I'm looking forward to that. Where he continues to unpack the consequences of Mandela's political pragmatism and his experience of political modernity as he explores Mandela not as romanticization, but rather a tragic hero with flaws who was saved by the important quality of self-awareness. These lectures thus offer us the opportunity to learn from Mandela as we come to understand in deeper ways how he came to be who he was and achieve what he did achieve. These lectures offer us the opportunity to reflect on what has shaped us as scholars and students, how we're implicated in the systems of injustice that we wish to combat, and how we might mobilize our own political pragmatism in order to live up to the responsibility that we have taken upon ourselves with our historic name change that we accepted in 2017, July. Professor Mangcu's lectures thus fittingly offer a fitting end to our year of celebrating and reflecting on the many Mandelas whose legacy we have inherited. I thank you for joining us, and I thank you, Xolela, for choosing to do this lecture here, because we could have chosen to do it anywhere. He was a young man when we were students together, and it has been a remarkable journey, and I really want to celebrate your scholarship. We hope to see you next weekend, colleagues, for the final lecture of the official closing of this productive year of celebration of Mandela's legacy and life. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, VC. Now, my role, colleagues, at this point is half done, which is to introduce the speaker, Professor Xolela Mangcu. Xolela Mangcu is professor of sociology at the George Washington University. Obviously, it's based in Washington, D.C., and he was previously the professor of sociology as well at the University of Cape Town. As you've heard from the VC, his various publications, he has published 9 books, including Biography, which won the UCT Meritorious Book Award in 2013, and is currently working on a new biography of Mandela. He obtained his PhD in city and regional planning from Cornell University, and his BA, his master's degree from Wits University. And recently, colleagues, he has been appointed as the director of the Africana Studies Institute or Center in the George Washington University. Colleagues, without wasting any time, let me invite our guest speaker to come and give the Untold Heritage Lecture of Nelson Mandela. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Xolela Mangcu.
Okay. Good evening. You know, Vice Chancellor, I was thinking about all those many years ago when we were students at Wits. We couldn't have imagined that we would be in a situation like this, where you being Vice Chancellor and me coming to speak as a guest. And Chairperson of Council and the leadership team at the university, I thank you for having me here. Thank you to Andre for all the work you put in getting me here. For some time before I started working on this book, I had been, in my public writings, expressing a concern about the lack of African scholarship, on black scholarship generally, on Nelson Mandela. I was perturbed by what Tommy Shelby and Brandon Terry, writing about Martin Luther King Jr., described as the process of ritual celebration and intellectual marginalization that revolves around Mandela. And I will organize my talk around those two aspects of that construction, the ritual celebration and the intellectual marginalization. You may wonder why I would talk about Mandela as a victim of intellectual marginalization, but I'll come to that. the ritual celebration was confirmed to me some years ago. I was in India, traveling as a guest of an Indian activist called Banka Roy, who was then running a college in India called the Barefoot College. The Barefoot College is in Tilonia in North India, and it trains and educates some of the poorest of the poor in India. I have never in my life seen the poverty that I saw in India. And as we were walking about, we came across a group of men, semi-naked, literally, haggard, as if they might not be of this world, and they could not speak English, and I could not speak their language. And so as we walked away without much success, I thought to ask them a question. I don't know what entered my mind, but I thought to ask them if they had ever heard of Nelson Mandela. I don't know where that came from. And their faces just lit up. And they spoke animatedly among themselves, as if to say, who does he think we are? A bunch of ignoramuses? How can we not know Mandela? This was in the farthest corners of the world, in the poorest of the poor, among the poorest of the poor, in a place where I couldn't communicate. And these folks recognized Nelson Mandela. The other experience that confirmed in my imagination, at least, Mandela's status as a world historical figure happened literally a year later, in 1998. I was a visiting scholar at Harvard University, and on September 18th, I remember that day vividly, when 25,000 people gathered for an event that had happened only twice in the history of Harvard, in the more than 300 years of Harvard's history. On that day, Mandela became only the third person to be awarded an honorary doctorate at a special convocation of Harvard University. The first recipient was George Washington in 1776. The second recipient was Winston Churchill in 1945. And in 1998, Mandela became the first African to receive that honor. These two events, one from the poorest of the poor and one from the most elite academic institution, in a way suggested the transcendent nature of Mandela as a global avatar for social justice and democracy. Harvard President Neil Rudenstein read the citation, and it went something like this: conscience of a people, soul of a nation, he brought forth freedom from the crucible of oppression. And inspired by his courageous example, the better angels of our nature. The last phrase, the better angels of our nature, was of course an allusion to Abraham Lincoln. The symbolism of the moment was not lost on Mandela, who mounted the podium and proclaimed, and I quote, "To the mind and to the future memory of this great American institution, the name of an African is now added to those two illustrious leaders of the Western world." The Boston Globe, the local newspaper, reported that the applause was nearly as sustained as all the speeches. As I watched those proceedings on that Friday afternoon, I could not help but muse quietly about a paradox that was perhaps known only to myself. I was possibly the only person in that crowd who had publicly criticized Mandela and disagreed with him for his preternatural reluctance to talk about race in South Africa. As I put it in one of my newspaper columns, Mandela had a rather generous interpretation of the racial situation in the country. Close quote. I believed, and still believe, that on race, he was kicking the can down the road. And that was a mistake on his part, leaving that task to his successors on an issue that he was singularly qualified because of his moral authority. Mandela, of course, was a darling of the white world. His biographer, Anthony Sampson, captured the growing sense of unease about Mandela among the younger generation of Africans. And I quote, "In his first months as president, Mandela enjoyed a brilliant honeymoon, particularly with white South Africans, to whom this tolerant old man came as a wondrous relief. At the end of the first 100 days in office, the Financial Times could find no whites who had a bad word for him. It was a normality which carried its own dangers, as black militants saw the revolution betrayed. To be sure, Mandela would not be the first leader to be criticized by his people. George Washington was severely criticized for conducting himself as a Republican monarch in the United States. And in fact, as Joseph Alice has argued, that was part of the reason why George Washington actually stepped down after only 2 terms in office. And of course, we know the narrative that he stepped down because he was a great leader, but he was just tired of the media attacking him also. Winston Churchill also returned after winning the war, returned to Britain, and was rejected by the British electorate and voted out of office. The same with de Gaulle, the French leader. As his biographer writes, de Gaulle was paradoxically the most revered and the most hated figure in French history. The same with Mikhail Gorbachev. His biographer, William Taub, writes, many, especially in the West, regard Gorbachev as the greatest statesman of the second half of the 20th century. But in Russia, he is widely despised by those who blame him for the collapse of the Soviet Union and the economic crash that accompanied. So this conflicted dimension of Mandela, this idealization of him abroad and contestation of him at home, is a universal phenomenon. However, I should rush to say that even though we criticized Mandela, even though we disagreed with him, I never ever imagined that we as a people would reach a day when a so-called radical would describe Mandela and liken him to Adolf Hitler. And that is what the artist Ayanda Mapuno did in depicting Mandela as Hitler. And when he was pressed on it, he doubled down and said, and I quote in the Sunday Times, "These Nazis with black skins like Mandela, who look like us, talk like us, and walk among us, left us unseeing, left us as zombies and black dust." You see, criticism is legitimate, but to liken Mandela to the most murderous figure of the 20th century is to cross the line of legitimate discourse. It hurts, and it hurts very badly. But there's something else that it does to a people and to a nation. As the historian Hayden White counsels, it is when heroes lose their capacity to inspire that the entire edifice of a society enters into crisis. Because not only a specific system of beliefs is undermined, but the very condition of possibility of socially significant beliefs is eroded. Our very essence is diminished. There is something paradoxical also about me as a critic of Mandela to be the first African to write a full-length biography. Think about that for a moment. How did it happen that, as I'm talking about African people or the black world at large, except for Fatima Meer, nobody has written a biography, a full-length biography of Mandela, the most revered, celebrated African leader in the 20th century, and we haven't done the scholarship. All that we read about Mandela, all the biographies that we read about Mandela are written by British and American scholars, whom I know, whom I respect, and some of whom are my friends. But that's neither here nor there. They don't know what Iqhiba means among the Thembu people. There are certain things that are beyond their ken. But also that's not the point. The point is what intellectual delinquency has allowed us not to write a single full-length biography of Nelson Mandela. And not only Mandela, Robert Sobukwe, there is not a single full-length biography of Robert Sobukwe. He's got all these militant comrades. Not a single biography of Sobukwe. The only book we have about Sobukwe, which is a memoir. There's a memoir, or there's a book, a small book by Nkredibe, and then there's a memoir by Benjamin Pogrund, but which is mostly about their relationship. But nobody has written a biography of Sobukwe. Pedro, how do you explain that? When I wrote Steve Biko's biography, it was the first biography, full-length biography of Steve Biko. How do you explain that? So you folks have got your work cut out for you. So what is it that a new biography of Mandela might suggest? Because it cannot be just a matter of saying, oh, no, it's people from Britain or the US who have written. That's not an argument. What is it that would come out of a different experience, a different perspective that comes from somebody who grew up in that part of the world, who knows some of the history? Many years ago, I invited, because I was concerned about this lack of scholarship on Mandela, I invited 3 very distinguished scholars to come to South Africa. It was the Nobel laureate Wally Soyinka and the Harvard scholar Henry Louis Gates Jr. and my dear brother, Cornel West. They came here and they gave a series of lectures on Mandela, which I then published in a little book called The Meaning of Mandela. In his lecture, Soyinka expressed a concern that there was nothing actually new. He worried, actually, that the world already knows what Mandela is, and that our greatest task is to avoid his banalization and to maintain a sense of proportion. What is it then that this new biography, despite Soyinka's warnings, can say that the world does not already know? And rather cheekily, I answer, everything. What you have in Mandela biographies is a cut-out image that is repeated in biography after biography after biography. It's almost like a cut and paste. And it goes something like this. That Mandela was a product of African traditional society. And that a crucial part, according to his official biographer, or authorized biographer, Anthony Sampson, that a crucial part of his leadership education lay in observing the guardian, the man who raised him, the regent, Jongintaba of Timberland. And that this had such an impact on Mandela that it prepared him for the presidency. Quite a leap. Sampson writes that as president, Mandela would seek to reach the same kind of consensus in cabinet. And he would always remember Jongintaba's advice that a leader should be like a shepherd directing his flock from behind by skillful persuasion. Close quote. Another biographer, Martin Meredith, writes that Mandela watched at close quarters, whatever that means, how the regent, his guardian, exercised chiefly power. And I quote, at tribal meetings, and I don't know how, these biographies of Nelson Mandela, all of them, use the term tribe to describe African people. A term that throughout our lives in the liberation struggle, we rejected. We rejected the term tribe completely because it was not only inaccurate in talking about black people, African people in particular, but it was a basis for the creation of the homeland system in this country. And we rejected it. How is it possible that there is this tribalization of African people in all of these biographies? Anyway, Meredith writes, at tribal meetings at the Great Place, when high-ranking councillors gathered to discuss both local and national issues, Mandela observed how Jongintaba would take care to hear all opinions, listening in silence to whatever criticism was made, even of himself. This was a style of leadership which made a profound impression upon Mandela. Peter Limb writes, Mandela's years at the Great Place impressed upon him the African tradition of leadership and conflict resolution. Archie Brown writes that the region's style of leadership, which, as Mandela recollected, was more collective than individual and had an impact on South Africa's future president. Phil Bonner, I could go on and on with this construction of Mandela's childhood and how it shaped him. Reading these descriptions, you would be forgiven for thinking that African people actually existed in what Leroy Vale calls a traditional pickle, smothered in traditional brine, unsullied by the winds of modernity. This construction of the African world has its roots, of course, in 19th century colonial anthropology of African people as traditional, as tribes. And that provides the framework of the existing scholarship on Nelson Mandela. And even those biographers and writers who acknowledge Mandela's modernity, they present it as a part of something that he only achieves when he reaches Johannesburg. And thus, Rita Barnard, in a volume called The Cambridge Companion to Mandela, writes that Mandela was the quintessential modern subject, a black South African born, that word again, in a tribal world, and ending up as a citizen of the world. You become a citizen of the world only when you get to Johannesburg. Before that, you exist in this traditional pickle. There's another problem with this construction, and it is part of the idealization. It is to suggest that Mandela was this inclusive leader in his cabinet. Bantu Holomisa might have a different view after he was fired by Madiba. Paulo Jordan might have a different view. Many other people who crossed him might have different views. His lifelong doctor and personal friend, Ndato Mutlana, described his personality as follows. He says, Mandela is a peacemaker. He has the ability to settle disputes, to talk to people, but he can be tough. When he is angry, he can be quite dictatorial. Tambo was a softie, a gentleman. But Madiba, even Mutlana uses this word, is a tribal chief. He ran a tight ship in the ANC. We all knew there were certain lines we didn't cross. There were few challenges to his authority. We respected him too much. One of my friends, and he allowed me to cite him on this, Oyama Mabandla, told me a story. In the build-up to the negotiations, a group of ANC intelligence people asked for a meeting with Mandela. And they were alleging that, there were people who were trying to position themselves for leadership. And the people they mentioned were some of Mandela's closest comrades, going back to university, people like Slovo and all of those people. Mandela was upset by this and literally chased these guys out of his office. But as Mabandla tells the story, Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu remonstrated with him in isiXhosa. Hayi Nelson. Bayeke bagqibe abantwana. No, Nelson, let them finish. He would have none of it. But the following morning, Mandela asked for a meeting with those fellows and apologized. As you will appreciate, he said, the people you mentioned are individuals I trust and have known for many years. But your role, of course, is not to spare my feelings, but to give me the facts as you see them. And so even though Mandela had that autocratic streak in him, as many leaders do, what saved him, I would argue, is a sense of self-awareness. What turns people with autocratic streaks into murderous dictators is a lack of self-awareness. Where does this self-awareness come from? I want now to offer an alternative theory of Nelson Mandela, which can perhaps help us understand this self-awareness. Absent from all of these books about Mandela are 3 points I would like to make, and then we can open it up for discussion. For reasons that I develop further in the book, the first point I want to make is that Mandela, Mandela grew up in the Transkei. We know that, right? He grew up in Timberland. We know that. But what we don't often know, because the biographies don't tell us, is that the Transkei was never settled by whites. It was never occupied directly by whites. What happened is that during the colonial, anti-colonial wars, you know, the frontier wars, in the 8th frontier war, the War of Mlanjeni, the British got a beating from Makoma in the Boma Pass, just outside Kaiskamahuk. Makoma inflicted so many casualties on the British that the colonial office in London instructed British troops who had been moving from Grahamstown and trying to move into the Transkei. And the colonial office said, stop. Because hundreds of people of their troops now were dying, and there was no guarantee that if they crossed into the Transkei, they would ever be able to defeat the many different kingdoms in the Transkei. And they stopped and they pulled back. And they didn't occupy the Transkei in the way that they had occupied the Cape. So the Transkei was one part of the country that was basically an indigenous reserve. None of the biographies discuss this. Why does this matter? This matters, in my view, without over-psychologizing Mandela, that when you grow up, you see, I grew up in King Williamstown, which was, you're from King Williamstown, right? King Williamstown was the hub of colonial racism. Okay? It moved from Grahamstown to King Williamstown. We were beaten on the streets all the time, right? We lived with that kind of everyday jackboot racism. And so we were traumatized. You can't not be traumatized by that kind of living, growing up as a child, and become angry. But I don't think you can write a biography of Mandela without mentioning that fact that he did not grow up in that kind of environment. And that gave him perhaps more trust than those of us who were growing up in King Williamstown. The second point I'd like to make, when the British withdrew from invading the Transkei, they supported a demand made by local whites to annex the Transkei, okay? To run the Transkei in the same way that they were running many African countries, without necessarily occupying it, but run it as a distant colony, and have your troops there, but annex this territory one by one. The biggest target, of course, was Timberland, because Timberland was the biggest kingdom in the Cape. And so the British supported the Cape colonial government's annexation of the Transkei. But you see, this was not a very difficult thing for the colonialists to achieve, for two reasons. and this is the controversial part of my book, or one of the controversial parts of my book. You know, almost the Mfengu people fought alongside the colonialists. Tayazi, no history, right? Somebody Xolela, but we know that history. But what we don't know is that Abatembu did the same thing. So Tembuland, what happened was this, okay? And I want to be very careful in how I phrase this. You see, in the existing relationships between different groups, even before the whites came, okay? Right? In the wars, in the conflicts that existed, groups often had alliances, built alliances with each other. So Amaxhosa may, hook up with Amapata and attack Abatembu, changing alliances. The arrival of whites introduced, it must be seen in that dynamic. So while it is easy for us to say, no, these people were selling out, there's another way of thinking about it, actually, which is not selling out. They looked at whites as potential allies, new allies, as they fought amongst each other. They're just other allies. But because we're looking at this thing from where we are right now, and the only language we know is ukutengisa, that's the only way we think about it. But if you are, and this is what happened, if you are Mandela's great-grandfather, Ungubenguka, in 1825, okay, you have just inherited the kingdom of the Tembu after your father, Undaba, who had weakened the Tembu kingdom. Ngubenguka invited first the Methodist Church because he knew that if he could invite the Methodist Church to build Clarkbury, there would always be troops around to protect the missionaries. And those troops would protect Abatembu against other groups. They set up Clarkbury. To cut a long story short, all of Ngubenguka's successors fought alongside the whites. Ngubenguka, Umtikaka, okay? Umtikaka actually went to one of the governors to ask to be incorporated into the British. And then they rejected him. And then Ungangelizwe, who's Umtikaka's son, continued in the same mode. Okay? Udalindyebo is a little bit of a skillful character. He plays both sides. Right? On the one hand, Udalindyebo, right, is cooperating with the colonialists, right? On the other hand, Uthumela inkomo to the launch of the ANC in 1912, right? And he's a friend of Walter Kgobusan, right? So he's playing both sides. The point I'm making about this is that when Cecil John Rhodes in 1894 pushes the Glenn Gray Act, all right, one of the things he does is to make a provision for something called iBhunga, the Transkei Territories General Council. It is my submission here that is the most important political institution, perhaps, in African political history in this country. What happened with the Bunga, right, is that annexation needed some kind of institutionalization. I know somebody's frowning, really? I'll come to why I'm making this argument. Annexation could not just depend on the cooperation of chiefs, individual chiefs. So what they wanted to do was to create a structure, a native parliament, where they divided, John Rhodes divided the Transkei into 26 districts. These districts would send delegates to Mthatha on an annual basis, and in Mthatha, they would have these annual meetings. They were parliamentarians of their time, okay? They deliberated on cattle dipping, they deliberated on schools, on roads, and they funded the existence of the University of Fort Hare. See why I was saying they were so important? Without the 10,000 pounds that the Bunga contributed, there would have been no Fort Hare. These chiefs in the Transkei, not only that, all the students who started, perhaps, most of them, 90% of them, were funded by Bunga scholarships. If you want to understand educational and political modernity in this country, you have to look at how the Bunga played an important role in that. What does this have to do with Mandela? First of all, there is no mention of the Bunga in any of the biographies. In fact, let me correct that. There's one mention of the Bunga in Anthony Sampson's biography, just one. How is it that an institution that was so pervasive in the Transkei, that determined every aspect of life in the Transkei, does not feature in any of the biographies? It is because of this tendency to go to the default of the tribe and tradition, and to ignore this experience in political modernity. When the chiefs entered the Bunga, actually, when they referred to each other, they don't, inside the Bunga, they referred to each other as councillors, as an indication or badge of modernity. Related to this is that Mandela's father was a member of the Bunga, uGadla Mandela. And you'll never see this. The irony, actually, is that Mandela, in the transcripts for Long Walk to Freedom, tells his ghostwriter about the Bunga. Mandela does say this. And Mandela does tell the ghostwriter about his father. But this American ghostwriter must have thought, this is just too complicated, and left it out. And so what I'm doing is, because all you need, and you can just, in fact, blame the American. The historians in this country, our fellow historians, they could easily have just gone to those boxes in the Transkei, which is what I did. I just went to Mthatha, knocked on the door, and wanted to look at whether uGadla really was a member of the Bunga. And what do I find? I find Gadla in his own voice, talking, confronting the magistrates, sometimes conniving with them, but well, that's how it is in the early 20th century. But the point I'm trying to make is that Mandela has got this heritage of modernity, which is untold by any of the biographers. Okay, and I do challenge you as students to actually make a trip to those archives, to read how uGadla. So what I did in my book, almost an entire chapter focused on uGadla. Because the only thing we get in the biographies about Gadla is one stereotype, okay? And the stereotype goes something like this. Gadla Mandela was, Sampson actually called him a pagan who inhabited a self-contained world. Why is Gadla a pagan? What is a pagan anyway? And what is a self-contained world for a man who's a member of the Bunga? uGadla was a friend of DDT Jabavu. DDT Jabavu was the first black professor in this country, and at that time, the most prominent African. In the autobiography, there's only just one mention of this relationship, and there is no discussion of what that relationship that Mandela's father had with the most prominent African actually signified. In Anthony Sampson's biography, Sampson refers to Jabavu only once, and he refers to him by his clan name. He just says Jili Jabavu, as if he doesn't know the name he was known by everybody in the community, DDT. That's how everybody called Jabavu. And Jabavu, in my view, had more of an impact on Mandela than these stories of the chief by the crow. Because, and this is the last item I want to add, which is when Mandela then is sent to school, he lives in the house of the king of the temple. All right, so he's a, I mean, not all of us get to live in the house of the king. So he's a privileged young man, and he's quite conscious of it. And actually, this leads to his own sense of vanity and superciliousness. I mean, he says that himself, that, he really believed nobody was better than himself. He says that in his autobiography. Well, if you're brought up in the house of the king of Tembuland, you begin to have that sense of, right? But again, what's important about Mandela, and he says this in a letter to Fatima Meer, is a sense of self-awareness about how important it is to work on this vanity, right? He's aware of that and he's working. That, for me, is a hallmark of leadership. To know what your limitations are and to continuously work on them. So in addition to growing up without this experience of racism, in addition to growing up in this culture of self-governance, it's an attenuated notion of self-governance, to be sure. But it's people who are actually discussing policy and fighting and having all these deliberations. And Mandela, by the way, used to accompany Jongintaba to the deliberations of the Bunga. Why can't the biographers just tell us that? Why must it be limited to what's happening near the crown? That Mandela used to accompany Jongintaba even when Mandela was at Fort Hare. So you cannot make an argument that he didn't know about the Bunga. Everybody knew about the Bunga. And the thing about the Bunga, by the way, is that everybody participated in it, including the radicals. People like Govan Beki, people like Ndamda, they were all part of the Bunga because it was extended to go beyond chiefs and to include civil society organizations. So in addition to this history of entanglement with colonial rule, and this history of entanglement with colonial rule, by the way, is not limited to the royal family. African people in the Cape educated, African people in the Cape generally, men, had the right to vote on the same basis as whites, right? But it was limited, it was a qualified franchise. So it was limited to men, educated, and propertied, right? But the importance of this for Mandela, I'm arguing, is that he grows up in a world, okay, in which African people have got this notion of citizenship. It's not something that starts in Johannesburg, all right, where Mandela, according to Barnard, becomes a citizen of the world. No. These people in Tembuland, in the Transkei, have got this notion, in the Cape, have got this notion of being citizens of the world. They go to conferences in London. Khubusana will accompany Dalindyebo. They go to conferences. They meet with people, W.E.B. Du Bois. These people are citizens of the world already from the Transkei. Khubusana becomes the first African to be elected. Brown is writing a biography of Khubusana. Khubusana becomes, what year was it, 1909 or 1910? Right? Khubusana becomes the first African in this country to be elected to the Cape Provincial Council, right? He becomes the first and the last because the older Jabavu, Baba Nomona, became jealous and ran against Khubusana. They split the African vote and the white candidate won. And that was the last time you had an African until 1994. So all I'm suggesting is that, and then finally, right, I write about Mandela as a black Victorian, okay? What do I mean when I talk about Mandela as a black Victorian or a black Englishman? Again, this is not limited to Mandela. It extends to my parents. It extends to the educated in the Cape. S.E.K. Mkhaya wrote a poem titled Singama Britane. That's how they saw themselves, the Cape educated elite. They gave me the name Tennyson, after the poet Lord Tennyson. I never use it. Now, Mandela is named after the admiral, the British admiral, right? Nelson. So these folks were educated in this way of seeing themselves at Hilltown, where Mandela went, but particularly at Fort Hare, under Jabavu. And at Fort Hare, when you read the biographies, all you get, I swear, about Fort Hare is Mandela's expulsion. As if that expulsion tells us is a precursor to his radicalism. And that's just plain lazy. What happened at Fort Hare is that Jabavu and Z.K. Matthews established all these social clubs at Fort Hare. The debating clubs, the social clubs, the literary clubs, right? And these students, Mandela is at Fort Hare, and Jabavu and Matthews tell them that this is a leadership training thing, that you as the African elite are expected to go out and play a leadership role in the world. So that's what I meant by self-awareness. They already know that this is what they are expected. But of course, right, you cannot always tell, right, or you cannot always know, right, the face of the visitor you are supposed to receive. I stole that line from Eric Hobsbawm. And this Victorian thing among the African elites is not limited to South Africa. It's a worldwide thing. You find it in Philadelphia, you find it in London. But it's a sense of there are these virtues and sense of honor and dignity, and Mandela embodied. You could see Nje Hambert. Okay? So the man, in my view, if you want to understand his sense of authority, you have to understand a childhood and a young adulthood that develops within this history of African modernity and reject this tribal chief thing. I'm not saying it's not important. It is important, obviously, because it's his background. But he went there only during school holidays. I mean, most of his life was at the mission schools and at Fort Hare. And I would argue that he had a much, so I shouldn't say reject, but I would say that there's a hybridity in his formation, right? There's a multidimensionality in his formation that is not there in these one-dimensional representations. Now, next week, I will talk about what happens to these black Victorians, right? What happens to these black Victorians, these educated Africans who've always had a sense of citizenship and authority in the world, who've always seen themselves as special. What happens to them in 1936, they are removed from the voters' roll. It's a process that has been going on for many years. But what radicalizes these folks is their removal from the voters' roll, right? And again, the biographies don't even go into that history of the All-African Convention, which, by the way, was chaired by Jabavu. Jabavu was a larger-than-life figure in the imagination of Nelson Mandela. But Anthony Sampson only mentions him in one sentence, and only by his clan name. So that's what I'm trying to do here is, and I'm suggesting, right, that if you did a similar thing with Sobukwe, you would find, I bet you, a different explanation for why he became who he became. And so for me, biography is a way of, first of all, disabusing ourselves of this notion that we had this revolutionary struggle with no one participating in the system. It was never like that, okay? It was always a process of entanglement and what I call this tragic pragmatism. Because African people are living under a condition of violent domination. And they have to find a way to make a way out of no way. And in that process, they have to compromise here and there. And we can sit here in 2019, pretend to be revolutionaries who would never have compromised or So I'm inviting greater empathy, okay, for the history of our people, for the sacrifices that they make. It's very easy to throw out a label. So and so was a sellout. You have to understand the intricacies, the contradictions of that history, and why and how these folks survived what Hannah Arendt calls the banality of evil that was apartheid. And this banality of evil begins in the 1930s, where this history of pragmatism that Mandela had and Victorianism that Mandela had comes into conflict with the tragedy of apartheid. And so that's why I talk about a tragic pragmatism from the 1940s onwards. So I look forward to developing that thesis next week. Thank you. Thank you. Oh. Oh, now the firing comes. Oh, yeah. Good. And it's better, I think it's better if you take it around.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Professor Xolela Mangcu, for that informative and rich lecture on the untold heritage of Nelson Mandela. Without wasting any time, colleagues, let me now invite the 2019 revolutionaries in the venue who would have never sold out to engage the speaker. I will note a round of hands.
Penny ambulance. Oh, okay.
Oh, sure. I am. Where are the roaming mics? Oh, it's the sophisticated venue. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. In that order, colleagues. Sure.
Thank you, Prof. Mangcu. I'm too far from this thing. Thank you, Prof. Mangcu, for such a beautiful lecture in trying to, in a way, shift us in this decolonial moment into seeing the epistemic center of Mandela, you know, rather than this Mandela that was celebrated. But I do want you to tell us, because I think in as much as you are saying that there's something important about a black person writing about another black person, you know, but you are not pushing it out there in terms of the authenticity of that scholarship. I would like you to actually just put it out there, you know, tell us what is it that is significant about umntu omaziyo omnye umntu in terms of language, in terms of claiming, in terms of everything, to write about that particular person. Because I do think that maybe in as much as you are coming with it, you are shying away in telling us about the issues of authenticity, the access to the language of the person, and the geography of that person. That is why I think, Achima Feje, what you're referring to about the ideology of tribalism, when Achima Feje is writing about that, to say that there is no the idea of tribe in any of these African languages that we tend to use. So I think I would like you to actually push you to actually get to what you want to get to with that. I know.
You're saying you must not say loud. Yes, later.
Nkosi, Prof, mna ngicela ubuza nje ngoba ukumkani obu kwintetho yakho ndiyava ingathi uyaphawula uba wayengeke kumkani nangona ungatshongo directly. Isuka phi le mbali yobukumkani babo ukuba bukhona ubukumkani bukaMandela?
Okay,
Muntu wesithathu.
I must claim it. Ndingumthembu. So yes. So that's the point exactly. That's the reason why I'm speaking. I think it's important that we can't compare Abatembu with Amamfengu, because we had land, we had kingdom. We weren't chess pieces in a chessboard. We were chess players, but we were outmaneuvered. So I can, that at least we can admit. Yes. So yes, it's important. Let's look at the war of Ungayeqibi. Umtirara is not fighting in the war. Mapasa is fighting. Mapasa is a Tembu chief. That we must recognize. He's fighting alongside with Umjing Makoma.
Yes.
Which Makoma, the great prof said, contributed a lot in the war. So that is important. Within the Tembu kingdom, there is no harmonious agreement that we are collaborating, or not collaborating is not the word. We are working as partners with whites. There is this developing mistrust, because if you look at what is called Tembu proper, will be around Umtata, and then you look at what we'll call Tembuki. That's how they called it in this whole colonial language. So that will be up maybe the side with Queenstown. So that side sort of interacted a lot with white people. So they sort of received how the colony or how the colonizers would treat people. Because the ones around Umtata are sort of shielded by Amaxhosa, Amachachabe, Ukubeka on that side. So the experience of those, it's quite different. So within Abatem, there is a fight. Yes. The other point is history. As much as there were no white people in the Transkei, but there is a history left there which sort of informed, maybe it would help informing him, because this I'm saying in relation to him trusting white people. When the Tembu kingdom collapses under Ungangelizwe, Uqeya Kamtirara, it collapses after the war. Abatembu fights with Usachili. Then there's this deployment of soldiers around by the colony, and it says, no, we're protecting you against Sahil. Sahil is coming. Sahil is going to attack you. Of course, he's dethroned after that. So that left a bitter taste. So there is that history of mistrust also. So he can also tap into that. And yes, that's the 2 points I wanted to raise.
Sure.
Thank you, Prof. You've really set my heart and mind on fire. And I want to pass the message that keep safe what has been entrusted to your care. First two questions are personal ones, because mainly in the room you've got younger academics and students. And I think it's important for you to share the response to this. The question I have, Prof, is my impression of you from when I came to know you in the mid-2000s was a fiery, radical black professional, black academic, radical black academic. Now, I want to ask this question because there's an attempt to revise history, which I trace to a psychology of pain among us, and wants to simplify history to either be a narrative of African people have always been great warriors that have contributed in a certain way, and before colonialism there was a utopian world that we lived in. And then the second one, and I want to ask you why for you it's important, this thing about the modern world that Mandela grows in, because it negates this need to want to premise the great contributions we've made as African people as having arisen out of what is otherwise the general heritage of African people. As opposed, so now when you are troubling the narrative for me, when you want to move Mandela out of the tribe in terms of his heritage to the complex modern world that he grows in, and I argue that you are now upsetting the psychology of pain, which we have, that wants to simplify history. And then also, I want to ask about in a chapter that we teach from, you talk about the role of mission education. You've touched a little bit about it today. The role of mission education in the broader struggle of black people in South Africa. The one question I wanted to ask for you is on the, and I suppose it's around Nkwelo that you are making to African intellectuals to write African history. What does the power of focus? Is it related to focus that you've been able to pay particular attention to the things you have and make the intellectual contributions that you are making? Put simply, how do you reproduce a Xolela Mangcu? Or somebody who's got the appreciation of the need for contribution to scholarship and the personal development path. What does the personal development path look like for somebody to respond to El Kwelo that you are now saying? Good.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. First of all, Prof, let me say siyabulela because some of us siyasakhabula kakhulu. But as you were speaking, Prof, I mean, I had a lot of questions in my mind, which are not necessarily based only on history of Mandela in a tribe, but Mandela being a person who's today celebrated a lot. Now, I just have a few questions. I think the first one, just for Bulaluvalo. In your view, Prof, what do you think Mandela meant when he said he fought against black domination? Now, the second question, understanding that Mandela is also part and parcel of the Congress movement, which shaped him to be the person that a lot of people know him for. Is there any historical context that perhaps we've missed for an agent of a social detoxification agenda to be celebrated by both the oppressor and the oppressed? Then now, my last question. I was asking, Prof, is there any historical context that perhaps we've missed in history that made the agent of a social detoxification agenda to be celebrated by both the oppressor and the oppressed? And then now, the last question, which is a bit direct, Prof. Do you perhaps think the emergence of Mandela as the first black president in a country which have both class contradiction and racial contradiction. Within it, there's also gender contradiction. Do you perhaps his emergence gave a breakthrough in trying to assist to resolve the race question, or rather it only entertained only the manifestations of the problem other than the nature of the problems which we're faced with? Thank you very much, Prof.
Wow. Andiyazi nizityisa ntoni ezi students apha. Okay, I think first let me just make a general point that I hope comes from what I'm trying to do. It would be nice, this is a general point I'm trying to, when we leave this place tonight, that we have a different conversation. Yeah. That's what if we could do that, I would have succeeded, okay? The specific details and disagreements and all of that are important. But for me, more importantly, would be a different conversation. Okay? That's the first thing. Because we are going to disagree. I mean, I would hate to live in a world where everybody agrees, right? Now, let me come to this issue of blackness and authenticity. There is something that Henry Louis Gates Jr. calls the shared text of blackness, okay? There is a language, a history, a heritage, things that in a way that right? Nuances, little things like that, right? So one goes there, equipped with that, all right? But I want to shy away from the claim to authenticity, okay? Because it's dangerous. You can't just say, because I'm black, therefore, take it or leave it. It doesn't work like that, all right? It's very easy for people to say, I am this. Identity does not translate into knowledge, okay? It's a basis for knowledge. But you can't, on the basis of it, claim knowledge or claim anything for that matter, right? Because identity in any event is always contested and it's always changing. So I think that there is a way of bringing out the importance of a black perspective, of an African perspective, without claiming to be authentic. I mean, there are things that I don't know about Abatembu, which I'm still trying to learn as I'm writing this book. And I may not know, I may not find. For example, the whole thing about the role of Ikriba. And Mandela came from Ikriba, Ebatenji. I get contradictory explanations, I talk to Mangomhlaba Matanzima, he'll give me one explanation, and I'll talk to Patekile Olomisa, he'll give me completely different, So being black is not going to give me answers to such questions. But I do hope that it speaks for itself. I'm not shy of saying, I'm black and I'm writing this book, but the argument must speak for itself. Ubukumkani, I mean, they are part of the Tembu kingdom. They are part of the kingdom. This is another part of I think, because Ungubenguka is a king. Now, they are not in the line of succession, but they are part of the royal family. Which brings me to the point, Tembu, that you were making. And maybe I didn't make this clear enough. That I'm talking about the Tembu royal family. I'm talking about Ngubenguka, Mandela's progeny, you know, Ngubenguka's progeny. Ngubenguka, Tikaka, Ngubenguka told before Tikaka, Ufadana, right, as the region, right? Fadana, Tikaka, Ngangelizwe. You left out, by the way, I noticed you left out why Usakheli wanted to attack Ngangelizwe. Why did you leave it out? I'll tell you why you left. I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. Because Ungangelizwe assaulted violently his wife, who was a daughter of Sakhili. And Usakhili, the reason Sakhili was attacking Ngangeli was to avenge his daughter. Okay? But the point I'm making is that what I'm trying to do is I'm looking at the history of the Tembu royal family. There is no question that the Tembu royal family aligned itself with the British. Omapasa, okay, is outside that. Omapasa is Upuma, right, from Ngubenguka's brother, right? It's another line, okay? But it's not the line of Ngubenguka. So yes, you are right. Abatembu were not the same. In fact, I write in the book about the role Abatembu played in developing African nationalism in this country. The Tembu Rebellion of 1880 in particular, but also Uneyemiya Tile and the Tembu National Church, which was a precursor to what we call Ethiopianism. So there is this, I didn't go into that and I should have. So there is this contradictory history among the Tembu of cooperation by the royal family and resistance by some of the junior chiefs. But also, you know, after the emigrant Tembu were cheated by the British, and then you had the Tembu Rebellion of 1880, you begin to have this nationalism that grows in Tembuland. So yes, Tembuland is very varied. But in terms of the royal family, I stand my ground. The issue of wanting to, it's important that I am not saying, and I'm glad for these questions because I can go back to my book and kind of, because I am not saying that the traditional heritage does not matter, okay? In fact, I think the whole tradition modernity thing is problematic, okay? It's a colonial anthropological divide, okay? That modernity anyway is an all-encompassing historical process. And that Abatembu, even as they are royal, they are in many ways modern. Bafunda Koma Lovedale, and they are part of this mission. There is no separation really. What I'm trying to avoid is this notion of African societies as being stuck on some state in the past. Because what goes with that is intellectual racism. What goes with that is the idea that African people belong, to a world that is not developed. And to demonstrate, quite frankly, the contributions of African people to modernity. iBhunga, all right? iBhunga played a critical role in the formation of the University of Fort Hare. Now, there's a guy at Oxford, and I've made my point on this, at Oxford University, Tim Gibbs. He wrote a book called Mandela's Kinsmen. And it's the same colonial anthropological analysis. The argument is the people of the Transkei are dominant in South African politics because bayazalan. They're kinsmen. Okay? That's a kind of colonial anthropological thing I cannot stand. Okay? The people of the Transkei are dominant in so many ways because they had a head start. They had a head start in education. Fort Hare was their institution for many years. So there's a long history there, a modern history, that we need to expand on. I don't think you can produce another Xolela Mangcu. You are who you are. You know, otherwise there might be problems, man. You might inherit some problems that Xolela Mangcu has. So be careful about that. You know, but I can tell you one thing though, that what has always been very important in my life, and I think it's this country's biggest challenge, is education. Okay? We need to read to our children. There's nothing I find more devastating than all the statistics that come out. That 50% of our children have never read a book. That our grade 10 children cannot read, even in their own languages. Right? That is this country's greatest threat. That we are not so the irony is that where I grew up, Ekinsberg, these folks were organizing. Biko died, but others continued. Winter schools. Okay, our education didn't stop just at school. The community took interest in our education. So you may not produce me, but you may produce young people with the curiosity. That's what it's about, okay? Because when you read, you have curiosity, and that's it. I'm a member of the Robert Sobukwe Trust. I just came back from Grafreinet, and they're working there in some of the most amazing things, working with children as young as 2 years old, 3 years old, because that's where it begins. But we've left that. It's our biggest crime, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Oh, no. Oh, sorry, man. Sorry. Remember, okay, let me go back to something I said, that these folks, including Mandela, in my view, all right, they come from a particular world, right? They inherit a particular political, not just political, but a particular cultural relationship to white people, right? They're educated to see themselves, right? That's how they're educated. And so, they have a certain deference to whites. They have a need to protect whites, okay? This is not peculiar to South Africa. You find it in India. You find it all over the world of these early nationalists, okay? So when Mandela talks about black domination and all of that, you need to understand it within, in my view, the political culture of the African elite at that particular point in time. And you need to be careful about looking at their actions through your own lens and imposing that lens on them. What I'm asking for in this book is for us to have not only greater historical understanding, but empathy. Okay? Empathy for our people. They suffer too much. Okay? I mean, during the course of writing this book, I sometimes came to tears because I never, ever empathized with Mandela. He was always just that abstract figure that I always criticized. But when I write about how this man, and not just him, all of them, I mean, here are these middle-aged professional black men, right? Who are taken, they're lawyers, they are whatever, they're taken to Robben Island, right? Now, listen to this and tell me if you can withstand it, okay? They get to Robben Island, they're stripped of their clothes, right? Stripped naked. They're given shorts and sandals, open sandals, right? And some makeshift thing to wear, right? That's the first thing. In the middle of the winter on Robben Island. Second thing, for 12 years, there's no hot water. These guys are getting cold showers every day for 12 years. I don't know if that experience is something that some of Mandela's critics can relate to. Because we grow up with hot water and, But what I'm saying is we need to try and put ourselves in the shoes of these people. They live in these cement cells, right? Basically, they're sleeping on cement and in these damp walls. When Mandela's child dies, they won't let him go and bury him. When his mother dies, they won't let him bury her. And Tina would turn around and say this guy was a sellout. After somebody is subjected to so much cruelty. So what I'm saying is it's important for us to disagree with Mandela, and I disagree with a lot of things. But that's the role of politics. But I do not pass judgment, less so now. Maybe earlier when I was a radical. Well, I'm just getting old, you know.
Colleagues, this brings us unfortunately to the conclusion of the lecture by Professor Xolela Mangcu. Thank you so much, Prof, and thank you, colleagues, for the contributions. Without wasting time, I would like to call Professor Mary Duka from the Department of Visual Arts to come and give the vote of thanks.
I'd like to thank you all as an audience and the organizers for affording me this privilege of standing here and acknowledging the professor. I'm not going to try to make intelligent sense of what has been spoken of and what has been talked through tonight. I'm taking away a great richness. I'm taking with me serious shame at my own ignorance about the history of the area that I was born in. And that is a fundamental takeaway for me. But this isn't about me, it's about acknowledging the significance of the year that's gone by, the Mandela celebrations that this university has put its heart and soul into, and the fitting culmination of these two lectures. Very wisely, the two lectures split so that there is like the next season to come back and to hear next week's episode. So I'm sure that the RSVPs are going to be flowing in. So in the last year, there's been this huge celebration of the significance of Mandela, and there's been the critique and the challenges that have come with the university's name, the university's allegiance to the name. And the activities have been rooted firmly, and I think the VC has acknowledged this on a number of occasions, have been rooted really firmly in this really carefully curated set of activities that have actually challenged and teased out all of the things that have been in the end highlighted today. This lecture has been a powerful way of culminating, or starting to culminate, these year-long celebrations. And after this evening, we move into the future. And our speaker, Professor Xolela Mangcu, has presented us with these really powerful understandings about a way of disrupting the tropes of history, disrupting the things that the country, ourselves, white people, have fallen back on, around looking for a cardboard cutout icon and not looking at the real troubling history that would not allow that kind of idealization to be tolerated. So that's my humble attempt at acknowledging the significance of this year and these occasions that tonight is one of. So Professor Mangcu, I'd like to thank you for sharing your thoughts and your research and your critical analysis of history. You're disrupting narratives of the old narratives. The only thing I can do is hide behind the words of Nicholas Mirzoff, the cultural theorist, who talks about that kind of disruption of taking apart the simplified notions of history. The counter-narratives that you are offering, which are way more difficult to process than the easy ones. So you've challenged us with your lecture, and you've challenged us in enormous ways, and you can tell that I'm losing my track here. I've taken so many notes that I'm going on to the easy bit now. And the easy bit is that I would really like to ask this audience to join me in extending our collective thanks to a number of significant people. The first is to our Chair of Council, to Ambassador January Badil, for her presence. I think everyone in the audience was really pleased and surprised to see you appearing to this evening. The second is to Professor Sibongile Mutwa, and for her speech, an acknowledgement, and then to the DVC in his new title, Mr. Hatsheti, I haven't practiced that one yet, that the people at Krishet asked that I make a special mention of the fact that your office has been so highly instrumental in coordinating these centenary celebrations and the support that your office and yourself have given in keeping the momentum going for this whole year. And then to Professor Harris and his colleagues from the Nelson Mandela Foundation, an acknowledgement of your presence, and then a thanks and an acknowledgement to the Dean of Students for his presence. And I think that this has all been done already, but I'm doing it again as my vote of thanks. The academic and the past staff who are here from the different schools and departments and faculties, heads of department, the faculty members, the staff, the friends of the university from the Nelson Mandela Museum, Mr. Bonke Tule and Mr. Tabelo, sorry, I'm going to do the dreadful thing here, Mbedzi. And then the community members, there are some community members from around the city who've attended, and then the students. And the students, the impressive revolutionaries of the present, and I acknowledge that as an aged member of this academy, for the vibrant questioning and the listening and the challenging that this set of questions has brought out, because that has been an enormously rich takeaway for everybody in this audience, I'm sure. And then lastly, the people who've made this event possible. So the people from the CSL, the events team, from marketing, Alison and Derani Kashe, and the Professor Keart's Krishet team, Pedro, Nobu, Professor Keart himself, and all of the other people who are in this audience from Krishet. I work on the same campus as Krishet, and I see at Bird Street campus how they carry the flag for this transformative process that this lecture series is part of, for this transformative process of naming and being part of a changed university culture. So I think I speak on behalf of the whole audience when I thank Krishet for their work, and I think we also could thank Krishet for the fact that they keep telling me to remind you to join them for the refreshments that are outside. So I'm not going to keep you any longer, but a round of applause for the audience and everyone else who's here. And then throw up with nerves.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
was managed. Colleagues, just a quick reminder. On Friday, we are going to have a seminar by Professor Xolela Mangcu at Bad Street. It starts at 3 o'clock, organized by Krishet. The title of the lecture is Rethinking the Legacies in the Midst of the War on Women Bodies, a Feminist Ghost Dance with Mandela. Friday, 3 p.m., Bad Street campus. Sure.